The disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont unfolded in one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes in Australia. Oak Park Station, the property where he was last seen, sits deep in the outback of South Australia, south of the small township of Yunta. This is a region defined not by urban markers or populated roads, but by vast expanses of open country that stretch into the horizon. The land is dry, red, and heavily weathered. It has a long memory of heat, dust, and isolation, and it shapes the people who live within it. For generations, remote pastoral stations have operated here with a rhythm that outsiders often struggle to understand. Life is dictated by weather systems, livestock demands, and significant distances between neighbours. In such an environment, community support is strong, but physical vulnerability is ever present. Oak Park Station fits this pattern. It is a working pastoral property surrounded by kilometres of unfenced terrain.
The station buildings are modest and functional, designed to withstand harsh summers and cold winter winds. The ground around them carries the signature features of the South Australian outback: compacted dust, patches of hardy vegetation, scattered rocks, and areas of uneven soil shaped by erosion. The color palette of the land rarely shifts. During daylight hours, the red earth dominates the scene. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch long across the ground, turning familiar surroundings into irregular shapes that can confuse depth and distance. This is part of the environment Gus lived in, and part of the environment that would later become central to a large-scale search effort. The local terrain is known not only for its remoteness, but also for the remnants of old mining activity scattered across the region. South Australia has a long mining history, and many of the smaller sites were abandoned decades ago. Some mine shafts were filled or fenced, but many remain open or partially collapsed. Over time, the desert environment alters their appearance. Dust storms can partially conceal openings. Vegetation grows around edges. Heavy rain, when it comes, causes erosion that reshapes the ground. As a result, there are locations where mine shafts may not be immediately visible to the untrained eye. This is one of the factors that later informed search operations around Oak Park Station. The weather in this part of the state is unpredictable. Winds move quickly across open plains. They pick up dust and scatter it across long distances, sometimes in swirling patterns that make visibility poor. On calm days, the air sits dry and still. On others, the environment can shift within minutes. Light conditions also play a significant role. The clarity of midday differs greatly from the diffused light of late afternoon, which can obscure footprints, minor ground disturbances, or small objects. Search teams in the outback have always acknowledged that timing can work against them, especially in the narrow window between sunset and nightfall. For the Lamont family, Oak Park Station was not merely a place of work, it was home. Living on an outback property involves a level of self-reliance that many urban families never have to consider. Children, including Gus, grow up surrounded by open space. They learn early how to identify common hazards, stay close to adults, and understand the rhythms of station life. Families who live in such areas are accustomed to watching their children play within sight, but also giving them room to explore. The distance between the station house and the surrounding paddocks often feels larger in theory than in practice. Daily life creates familiarity and routine. For the Lamonts, this routine included afternoon activity outside, moments of supervised play, and the natural movement between indoor and outdoor areas typical of pastoral properties. On the day Gus was last seen, the sequence of events leading up to his disappearance was, by all accounts, ordinary. It was late afternoon when he was outside near the station buildings. The time was around 5 p.m. This period of the day is generally quieter on a pastoral property, as the heat begins to ease and work transitions towards evening tasks. According to the family, nothing unusual was happening. The environment was familiar, and Gus was within an area he had been in many times before. When a family member called him inside around 5:30 p.m., he was no longer visible. The assumption was that he had moved slightly out of sight or into another part of the yard.
Only when repeated checks revealed no trace did concern escalate. This moment marked the beginning of what would quickly become one of South Australia's most significant missing person searches. Within hours, neighbours, local volunteers, and emergency responders mobilised. Word travelled rapidly across the region, and the scale of the response grew. Search teams recognised immediately that this was not a suburban environment where boundaries are predictable. This was the Outback, a location that demands respect from anyone who enters it. The terrain offered countless possibilities, each shaped by distance, ground conditions, and natural hazards. While many Australians understand the concept of rural isolation, few truly appreciate how vast and complex the landscape becomes once the sun sets and the temperature drops. The early hours of a missing child search are dominated by urgency. In the case of Gus Lamont, urgency was paired with the complexities unique to outback geography. The absence of immediate signs, such as footprints, clothing, or disturbed soil, added difficulty. Search leaders had to consider how quickly environmental factors might erase small indicators. A gust of wind can flatten loose dust. A shift in sunlight can conceal shallow depressions in the ground. This is why the Outback is frequently described as one of the hardest environments in the world for search and rescue operations. It does not provide easy clues. It does not offer consistent visibility. It does not behave predictably. The impact of Gus's disappearance spread quickly beyond the region. News outlets across Australia picked up the story. For many, the combination of a young child, a remote station, and an environment marked by old mine shafts created a sense of unease. People who had never been to the South Australian Outback could still recognise the severity of the conditions. Families living in cities and coastal suburbs responded with the same concern as those in rural communities. The lack of immediate answers intensified public attention. Australians are familiar with the dangers posed by remote landscapes, but they are equally familiar with the strength of community support during crises. The response to Gus's disappearance reflected both realities. From the outset, the central question in the minds of investigators, locals, and the wider public was straightforward. How could a child disappear so quickly in a place where the terrain seems open and unobstructed? This question would guide the actions of search teams in the days that followed, and set the stage for the focus on mine shafts and ground hazards that would become critical in the later phases of the investigation. Understanding the 30 minutes between 5 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. on the day Gus Lamont disappeared is central to the investigative narrative. This half-hour represents the final confirmed period in which he was seen, and it forms the core of public discussion about how a child could vanish in an area that, at first glance, appears open and straightforward. While the landscape around Oak Park Station stretches wide and mostly unobstructed, the details within that space tell a different story. To grasp why the timeline feels so difficult to reconcile, it is necessary to reconstruct it with clarity and restraint, focusing only on what is known or reasonably inferred. At approximately 5 p.m., the late afternoon light at the station was beginning to soften. Temperatures in this part of South Australia typically ease during this time of day, creating a calmer period between the heat of the afternoon and the cool that follows sunset. According to the family, this was a routine moment. Gus was outside near the main living structures of Oak Park Station, an area he was familiar with. The distance from the house to the open paddocks varies depending on direction, but the immediate yard area is generally considered safe, especially for a child who has grown up in this environment. There were no reports of unusual activity or unknown vehicles. No one noted anything that would have suggested a risk unfolding. The ground surrounding the building presents a mixture of compacted soil, loose dust, patches of vegetation, and occasional shallow depressions created by erosion. While the land appears expansive, there are subtle features that influence where a child might walk and how easily adults can observe movement. At 5 p.m., visibility was still adequate. Shadows were lengthening, but not yet obscuring the terrain. This point in the day typically provides a clear view of movement within the immediate vicinity. Within this context, Gus being outside was not out of the ordinary.
As the minutes progressed, his movements were not specifically tracked. This is not unusual for a rural property. Children often move between the front of the house, the side areas, and small distances away from fences or sheds. The assumption is always that an adult will call them in shortly and they will respond.
What is important in this scenario is that nothing recorded during this period suggested distress or difficulty. There were no sounds that caused alarm. The natural sounds of the outback late in the afternoon would have been present. Wind across patches of dry grass, the faint rustle of birds settling, and the low hum of any nearby equipment cooling after use. None of these would typically mask a cry for help at close range. The area between the doorway of the house and the beginning of open ground is not extensive. Depending on the direction, it could be measured in a few dozen meters. Past this point, the land becomes broader and more irregular. For someone standing at the house, a child just beyond the initial slope or patch of vegetation could potentially be out of sight without having traveled far. This is one of the elements that creates uncertainty within the timeline. The line of sight limitations are subtle but meaningful. By around 5:10 p.m., nothing unusual had occurred.
Gus was still assumed to be near the house. The environment remained consistent. No strong gusts of wind, no dust disturbance, and no sounds indicating movement into rougher terrain were noted. Search teams later examined this period closely, because early minutes can provide clues about direction of travel. In this case, no such clues were present. Whether Gus stayed close to the house or moved slightly away during these minutes cannot be stated with certainty. Between 5:15 p.m. and 5:20 p.m., the shift in light would have become more noticeable. Even so, this did not create conditions where visibility collapsed. It was still a tolerable level of afternoon brightness. This portion of the timeline remains one of the most frequently questioned because it represents the last likely interval during which Gus might have walked into an area that reduced his visibility from the house.
Still, no one reported hearing footsteps, movement through vegetation, or any abrupt interruption of normal station activity. At around 5:25 p.m., the situation remained quiet. In many Australian pastoral households, this is the point where evening routines begin. Dinner preparations, gathering tools, or checking on livestock may occupy adults' attention. It is common for a child to remain outside until called in. In this instance, even with small tasks underway, the proximity between the indoor space and the yard meant that any concerning noise from Gus would likely have been heard. However, the timeline holds steady. No cries, no sounds indicating a fall, no evidence of sudden movement. At 5:30 p.m., a family member called for Gus to come inside. This is the point where the sequence becomes sharply defined. When he did not appear, the assumption was that he had moved only a short distance away. A brief search of the surrounding area began almost immediately.
What followed was a rapid escalation from routine to concern. The absence of immediate visual contact set off a series of checks. Behind the house, along the side, near sheds, and towards the beginning of the paddock. Within minutes, these checks expanded, and the first signs of worry emerged. Still, there was no sound, no disturbance, and no object out of place. The critical aspect of this timeline is not what was heard, but what was not. There were no screams, no calls for help, no sounds of slipping gravel or shifting soil. There were also no visible footprints leading away from the property, which, in the dusty terrain, might typically be expected. There were no drag marks, no patterns indicating a struggle, and no items left behind. For investigators, the absence of these markers stands out. In an environment where the ground is largely responsive to movement, the lack of evidence complicates interpretation.
This is where the perception of Gus having disappeared into thin air began to take hold. While the phrase itself is an expression rather than a factual description, it captures the difficulty people face when trying to reconstruct events that leave no physical trace. A child in a compact area, under routine circumstances, with adults nearby, should typically be located quickly. When that does not happen, attention naturally shifts to the landscape itself. As search teams reviewed the first 30 minutes, they noted the proximity of the house to areas where the ground becomes uneven and where old mine shafts are present within the wider property. The understanding that some shafts may be partially concealed or narrow enough to escape immediate detection added another layer to the investigation. Although there was no direct evidence pointing towards a shaft at this stage, the lack of indicators in all other directions made it necessary to consider the possibility. This timeline, therefore, became a catalyst for expanding the search into mine-related hazards. It demonstrated that the straightforward explanations did not align with the available information. The absence of sound, sight, or ground disturbance required investigators to widen their focus beyond the immediate yard and into geological features that might not typically be associated with a missing child, but are part of the reality of the South Australian outback. When the initial search for Gus Lamont produced no physical evidence, investigators were forced to consider less immediate but geographically relevant hazards. One of the most significant among these was the network of historic mine shafts scattered across the wider South Australian outback. To understand why this direction of inquiry became central, it is necessary to examine both the history of mining in the region and the characteristics of these abandoned sites. This part of the state carries a long legacy of mineral exploration, and although many operations are no longer active, the physical remnants remain embedded in the landscape in ways that often go unnoticed until an incident draws attention to them. South Australia's mining history spans more than a century. Early settlers and prospectors were drawn to the region by deposits of copper, gold, and silver. Small claims were dug across broad tracts of land, with some evolving into established mines and others remaining small-scale exploratory shafts. Over time, especially through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hundreds of shallow and deep shafts were created across the outback, many of which were later abandoned when yields dropped or miners relocated to larger operations. While some sites were mapped and recorded, many were not. In periods where record-keeping was inconsistent or where claims changed hands between individuals, shafts were dug quickly, used briefly, and left without formal documentation. In the decades since, these shafts have aged. Some have collapsed partially. Others remain structurally open but concealed by wind-blown dust, light vegetation, or changes in terrain caused by erosion. The sheer number of unmarked shafts makes the landscape particularly complex. When search teams reviewed the topography around Oak Park Station, they identified that the region had a documented mining presence and that the possibility of undocumented shafts could not be dismissed. Although the immediate area near the homestead was familiar to the Lamont family, the wider property extended into ground shaped by historical activity. Given that outback properties often span thousands of acres, it is not uncommon for landholders to know the general features of their land while still having pockets of terrain that contain inherited hazards from earlier periods. Mine shafts in this region vary significantly in size and depth. Some are barely a metre wide, while others can be several metres across. Depths also differ, ranging from shallow exploratory holes to shafts descending more than 20 or 30 metres. The danger lies in how they present on the surface. A shaft does not always appear as a clean vertical drop. Over time, edges crumble, loose earth builds up, and the opening can appear as a shallow depression rather than a void. A thin crust of hardened soil created by repeated dust layering can develop over the opening. This layer might support small debris or vegetation, but will not support the weight of a child. For investigators considering the disappearance of a 4-year-old like Gus Lamont, the characteristics of these shafts present a credible risk. A child's weight and limited awareness of ground inconsistencies could make it possible for them to step onto a concealed surface. If the ground beneath collapsed, the fall could occur quickly and quietly, making detection difficult. In an environment where wind carries across open plains and where shadows are long in the late afternoon, even a moderate sound could be lost. The absence of any cry or impact noise reported by adults nearby does not eliminate the possibility of a fall into a deep or partially enclosed space where sound absorption is likely. Australia has, unfortunately, a recorded history of incidents involving old mine shafts. While not common, the cases that do exist demonstrate how unpredictable these structures can be. In several instances across different states, livestock, hikers, or children have fallen into shafts that were assumed to be filled, inactive, or insignificant. Rescue operations in such circumstances are always challenging due to the instability of surrounding soil and the risk of further collapse. These incidents serve as reminders that old mining areas require caution, even when there is no visible sign of a void on the surface. For search teams operating near Oak Park Station, this historical context contributed to the decision to broaden the investigation. The absence of footprints or other ground indications near the home was a significant factor. In outback terrain, loose dust often holds impressions well, especially near dwellings where the ground is more compacted from repeated foot traffic. When search teams found no tracks leading away from the property, they had to consider that movement could have occurred in a direction or onto a surface that did not retain prints. Mine shafts and erosion features can disrupt soil composition, creating areas where impressions are less likely to remain visible. Additionally, the late afternoon wind patterns in the region can disperse light dust within minutes, reducing the likelihood of finding consistent tracks. Another complicating element was the lack of discarded items or disturbed vegetation. Children who wander into bushland or open paddocks often brush against shrubs, move loose objects, or leave small signs of passage. None of these indicators were present in the areas closest to the house. While this absence of evidence does not confirm a fall into a shaft, it does narrow the range of plausible explanations. When combined with the silence reported during the crucial 30-minute period, investigators were left with a situation where typical surface-based search patterns produced no reliable direction of travel. This is where the geological features of the outback become relevant.
The terrain around Oak Park Station contains both natural depressions and remnants of historical mining. In some areas, erosion channels can resemble shallow pits. In others, a genuine shaft may appear as a patch of slightly darker soil or a subtle change in elevation. These visual cues are not always obvious, particularly during the low-angle light of the late afternoon. A child like Gus Lamont, moving even a short distance beyond the immediate yard, could encounter such a feature without recognizing it as hazardous. The possibility of a mine shaft being partially obscured by dust or loose earth played a significant role in shaping the investigative approach. Search teams acknowledged that even a trained adult could pass near an unmarked shaft without identifying it. When viewed from a distance, these features blend into the surrounding ground, and only close inspection reveals their structure. This understanding reinforced the need for a methodical examination of the wider area, including locations not previously considered dangerous by those living on the property. Given these factors, the shift in focus towards mine shafts was not speculative, but grounded in the realities of the region's history and geology. The lack of surface evidence made it necessary to examine subsurface hazards. This direction did not exclude other possibilities, but provided a logical pathway for search operations when standard explanations did not align with observed conditions. By the time the investigation entered its next phase, teams were already preparing specialist equipment to assess deeper structures. The transition into this stage reflects a natural progression based on the limitations of the initial search and the environmental context of the South Australian outback. The next part of this narrative examines how these specialized tools and personnel were deployed, and why they became essential in the effort to locate Gus Lamont. Once investigators accepted that abandoned mine shafts in the region could not be dismissed as a potential factor in the disappearance of Gus Lamont, the search effort entered a more technical and resource-intensive phase. Unlike surface searches, which rely heavily on visibility, tracking, and manual grid sweeps, underground hazards require specialized equipment and highly trained personnel. This transition marked a significant escalation in the complexity of the operation. It also demonstrated the seriousness with which authorities approached the possibility that Gus may have encountered a concealed shaft or unstable geological feature near Oak Park Station. The first layer of this expanded search involved the deployment of specialized drones. In most large-scale Outback investigations, drones act as an extension of the search team's field of view. For the Lamont search, they were equipped with a combination of thermal imaging, LiDAR scanning, and night vision cameras. Each tool served a distinct purpose. Thermal imaging allowed operators to identify heat signatures across wide areas, which can reveal warm ground, disturbed soil, or cavities emitting retained heat. Although conditions can affect accuracy, it remains a valuable method for detecting anomalies that might otherwise go unnoticed. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, operates differently. By sending rapid pulses of laser light across the terrain, it creates high-resolution mapping of the ground surface. This technique is crucial in environments where natural erosion or dust accumulation may obscure depressions. For the search related to Gus Lamont, LiDAR helped identify subtle shifts in ground elevation consistent with collapsed or partially filled shafts. In ordinary light, these variations may appear insignificant. Through LiDAR data, however, they stand out with measurable precision. Night vision cameras provided additional coverage during evening operations. Outback searches do not always pause completely after sunset, particularly when conditions are stable. The combination of drones equipped with these sensors meant that large sections of land could be examined without immediate physical entry. This reduced risk to search personnel while providing essential reconnaissance data for planning ground-based operations the following day. Despite the capability of drones, visual assessment of surface irregularities is only the first step. Many mine shafts narrow abruptly or extend vertically beyond the reach of onboard cameras. For this reason, search teams deployed tethered robots specifically designed for subterranean inspection. These devices are lowered by cable into suspected openings. They carry lights, cameras, and environmental sensors, providing real-time footage to operators at the surface. Their compact size allows them to navigate tight or unstable spaces deemed too dangerous for human entry. In the case of the search for Gus Lamont, these robots played a significant role in determining whether shafts contained voids large enough to pose a risk. Their sensors also provided data on air composition within the shafts, which was crucial. Changes in oxygen concentration or elevated levels of carbon dioxide or other gases help determine whether a hole is connected to deeper cavities. This information indicates whether a shaft has maintained structural integrity or has collapsed internally. Understanding these dynamics assists mine rescue experts in deciding whether a site requires further investigation or can be safely ruled out. Environmental monitoring also extended to handheld devices used by ground teams. Before any deeper inspection could occur, specialists measured oxygen levels, carbon dioxide concentrations, and the presence of hazardous gases. Outback mine shafts can trap stagnant air, particularly where collapses block natural ventilation. Such conditions pose a danger not only to potential victims, but also to rescuers. Safety protocols required these measurements to be taken before personnel entered any suspect area. A central component of the ground search was the involvement of Aboriginal trackers. Their expertise is well recognized in Australia, particularly in remote regions where ground conditions can be difficult to interpret. Trackers examine subtle disturbances in soil, vegetation, and natural patterns of erosion. Their ability to read terrain provides context that drones or sensors cannot always capture. In the search for Gus Lamont, trackers were tasked with identifying pathways or signs of disturbance leading towards areas where old shafts were likely to exist. Although no definitive tracks were found, their assessment helped eliminate certain directions and narrow focus on others. When a shaft warranted closer inspection, mine rescue experts were brought in. These specialists are trained in navigating unstable underground environments. Their procedures are methodical and cautious. Before entry, they conduct structural assessments of surrounding soil. They examine edges for cracks, measure surface tension, and assess the likelihood of further collapse. If conditions permit, a rescuer is lowered using secure harnesses and monitored continuously. Movements are slow and deliberate.
In shafts with loose walls, even minor shifts can destabilize the ground. Modern mine rescue operations prioritize safety above speed, particularly in remote regions where assistance is not immediately accessible. The process for assessing a single shaft can take hours. In some cases, the approach, initial evaluation, robotic inspection, environmental testing, and final sweep can extend across an entire day. When multiplied across dozens or potentially hundreds of historical shafts, the scale of the operation becomes evident. For the search teams attempting to locate any sign of Gus Lamont, the time required per site meant that progress inevitably felt slow, even though procedures were followed with precision. Safety considerations prevented rushing, and the geography prevented rapid movement between locations. Night and day searches each introduced unique challenges. During daytime, visibility is ideal for identifying surface anomalies and reading geographical features. However, heat affects drone operations and can distort thermal imaging results. At night, cooler conditions improve the accuracy of thermal scanning, but ground teams face reduced visibility and increased hazards. As a result, search coordinators alternated methods depending on the time of day, choosing tools best suited for each window of opportunity. This allowed them to maintain continuity while managing risk. The combination of technical equipment and specialist personnel demonstrated the seriousness with which authorities approached the possibility that an abandoned shaft was involved in Gus Lamont's disappearance. Even in circumstances where the likelihood seemed statistically low, the absence of evidence at the surface required investigators to consider every plausible scenario. The geological history of the region, combined with the lack of footprints, disturbed vegetation, or traceable sound, strengthened the rationale for a detailed underground assessment. This phase of the investigation required patience. Each shaft investigated represented a thorough commitment to eliminating or confirming a potential hazard. The time spent on each site reflects the inherent difficulties of outback search operations where distances are large, terrain is unpredictable, and historical infrastructure creates risks that are not present in urban settings. From this point, the next logical step in the narrative focuses on evaluating how a child might physically encounter such a hazard, and what factors could contribute to a fall into a concealed or unstable opening. As the search effort progressed and the examination of abandoned mine shafts intensified, investigators were compelled to consider the physical possibility of a child, specifically a 4-year-old, like Gus Lamont, falling into such a structure. This analysis required a measured approach grounded in observable facts. The aim was not to speculate, but to understand whether a fall into a concealed or unstable shaft could realistically occur under the conditions present around Oak Park Station. By focusing on dimensions, ground features, child behavior, and acoustic factors, search teams could assess whether this scenario aligned with the absence of surface evidence found during earlier stages of the investigation. The first point of consideration involved dimensions. Many historic shafts in South Australia vary between 30 and 50 centimetres in width at the surface, especially those that were dug as preliminary exploratory holes during early mining periods. These openings may seem narrow by adult standards, but for a small child, they represent a legitimate hazard. At 4 years old, Gus Lamont would not have had the shoulder breadth or weight distribution of an adult. Depending on the exact configuration of the shaft opening, it is physically possible for a child of his size to slip through a gap of this width, particularly if the edges were weakened, sloped, or concealed by debris. The potential for a fall increases when the surface layer above the opening is compromised by time, erosion, or the accumulation of dust. The second factor considered was the presence of thin, crusted soil, sometimes found above old shafts. Over decades, wind can carry layers of dust that settle across depressions. When repeated over time, these layers harden into a surface that appears stable, but has little structural integrity. It is not unusual for such coverings to hold small objects, sticks, or stones, creating the impression of solid ground. However, they are not capable of supporting a child's weight. A single step,
especially if placed near the center of this thin layer, could cause it to collapse instantly. This type of breakage is typically quiet. The material gives way inward rather than outward, reducing the likelihood of producing a sound loud enough to alert nearby adults. The collapse happens in a downward motion, drawing loose soil with it, and can occur in one continuous movement. Investigators also examined behavioral possibilities. A child in the Outback environment may move for a variety of reasons, often without recognizing hazards in the landscape. One scenario considered was a simple misstep. If Gus had been walking near the edge of an erosion channel or lightly covered depression, a shift in weight could have been enough to cause a fall. This is consistent with minor slips that do not leave visible drag marks or prints, especially on mixed soil terrain. Another scenario involved the sudden collapse of unstable ground. Outback soil can appear compacted while concealing deeper voids beneath. In such cases, the ground beneath a child may give way without warning. The surface may not shift enough to create visible changes for searchers arriving minutes later. Loose soil falling inward might even conceal part of the opening, depending on the depth and structure of the cavity. Investigators also considered the possibility that Gus may have moved towards a sound or an object of interest. Children often react instinctively to noises such as birds, insects, or distant machinery. They may also follow small animals briefly without intending to wander far. In the environment around Oak Park Station, such movements could lead a child slightly off the main yard area and towards less stable sections of terrain. A child's steps are typically light, and the absence of clear tracks does not rule out movement across compacted or wind-affected ground. Acoustic considerations formed another important part of the analysis. One of the most frequently asked questions from the public involved the absence of audible distress calls. To assess this, investigators examined the acoustic properties of vertical shafts. Sound behaves differently in enclosed spaces. A narrow shaft with straight walls can absorb or redirect noise downward. If a child were to fall into such a space, initial sounds may be limited, and any cry for help could be significantly reduced in volume. Factors such as depth, wall composition, and the presence of loose material can further affect how sound travels. Some shafts contain pockets that act as natural sound traps, preventing noise from escaping to the surface. This means that even if a child vocalized, it may not carry far enough to be heard at ground level, particularly in late afternoon conditions where wind movement can disperse sound horizontally. In assessing risk, search teams also compared the implications of falling into shallow versus deep shafts. A shallow shaft may have an uneven bottom or collapsed materials that create noise during a fall, but these sounds may still be muted depending on the structure. A deeper shaft, however, often creates a different set of acoustic challenges. If the fall is vertical and unobstructed, the initial impact sound may occur far below the surface, making it difficult for anyone above ground to detect. The temperature difference between the interior of the shaft and the surrounding air can also influence how sound travels. These factors collectively contribute to a plausible scenario in which a fall could occur without drawing immediate attention. The behavior of dust and loose soil in the Outback further complicates the detection of such incidents. If a child were to fall through a thin layer of soil covering a shaft, the disturbed material would typically fall with them. Once a void forms, remaining loose soil around the perimeter may shift inward, partially concealing the opening within minutes. Outback wind patterns, particularly in the late afternoon, can redistribute fine dust rapidly. As a result, the surface may appear largely undisturbed even shortly after an event. Searchers would then find no clear edges, no displaced soil, and no identifiable footprints leading directly to the site. Investigators did not rely solely on theoretical analysis. They examined comparable incidents in Australia's mining regions where livestock or individuals encountered concealed shafts. In several documented cases, the fall occurred quietly and the opening remained partially or fully disguised afterward. These cases provided context for understanding how a child's fall could remain undetected during the initial search. The comparison does not indicate a conclusion,
but illustrates that the geological and structural conditions at Oak Park Station are consistent with known hazards in similar areas. Despite the detailed nature of this analysis, investigators maintained a cautious approach. The possibility of a fall into a concealed shaft is neither confirmed nor dismissed outright. It is one scenario supported by environmental factors and the absence of surface evidence. The analysis serves as a logical extension of the information available up to this stage of the investigation, providing a framework for understanding how such an event could occur without attracting immediate attention. The search effort then shifted towards evaluating specific shafts and depressions across the landscape, each requiring careful inspection. The next part of the narrative focuses on how these locations were identified, assessed, and systematically ruled in or out as potential sites connected to the disappearance of Gus Lamont. Once investigators acknowledged that a concealed shaft could not be excluded as a possible explanation for the disappearance of Gus Lamont, the search shifted into a slow, methodical, and heavily documented process. Each suspected shaft, depression, or erosion feature across the terrain surrounding Oak Park Station required individual assessment. This phase of the investigation demanded patience, technical accuracy, and an understanding that many of these sites had not been examined for decades. The search teams approached each location with the awareness that conditions varied significantly from one site to the next, even when they were only meters apart. The first group of shafts examined were those closest to the homestead. These were prioritized because they sat within distances a 4-year-old might realistically cover in a short period. Some were already known to the property owners, while others were identified through drone mapping and LIDAR scans. One shaft, approximately 30 meters from a boundary fence, measured around 7 meters deep. Its opening was narrow and partially ringed with loose rock. Drone footage showed no movement or disturbance around the perimeter. When a robotic camera was lowered into the shaft, it revealed compacted soil at the base, with no recent disruption. Atmospheric readings indicated normal oxygen levels and no unusual gas concentrations. Investigators ruled out this shaft as a potential location connected to the disappearance. A second site, located further south, presented different challenges. This depression appeared subtle from ground level, but showed a more defined contour line in LiDAR data. The surface was uneven, with patches of hardened soil and scattered vegetation. The depth was estimated at 10 meters, though internal collapses made accurate measurement difficult. When the robot descended, it encountered loose material around 2 meters down, followed by a narrow vertical drop. The footage found no clothing, no recently disturbed soil, and no evidence of organic material beyond old roots. While the structural composition suggested long-term stability issues, there was no direct connection to the search for Gus Lamont. This site was also eliminated. A third shaft, located east of the homestead, was considered one of the more concerning areas due to its partially concealed surface. The opening was only visible from certain angles. Dust accumulation had created a light crust that, from above, appeared almost level with the surrounding ground. Drone images captured slight depressions around the perimeter, but these could not confirm whether the surface had been recently disturbed. When tested, the crust broke easily under pressure. The depth measured approximately 18 meters. Robot inspection revealed a narrow vertical shaft with significant debris buildup at the bottom. Environmental sensors detected low oxygen levels, consistent with an enclosed cavity. Despite the hazardous structure, no visual or physical evidence relating to Gus was found. As teams moved further outward, they encountered shafts that were older and more unstable. One site, approximately a kilometer away, contained signs of historic mining activity, including rusted fragments of equipment and timber supports that had long since deteriorated. This shaft was wider than others, roughly 2 meters across, with a depth of more than 20 meters. Entry was impossible due to the risk of collapse. Instead, investigators relied entirely on the robot. The footage showed irregular rock formations and a partially blocked lower chamber. While the robot explored as far as possible, the chamber beyond the obstruction could not be accessed. This meant the site could not be fully ruled out, but the likelihood of relevance to the case was considered low due to distance and hazardous access patterns. It was recorded as a location requiring later review if needed. In another section of the property, search teams discovered a cluster of small exploratory holes typical of early mining attempts.
These holes varied in depth from 1 to 3 meters and were often covered by vegetation. Because they were shallower, they were easier to assess. Most contained loose soil and animal activity, but showed no signs of recent disturbance. The surrounding ground had not shifted, and no impressions suggested the presence of a child. They were ruled out quickly, though each required thorough documentation. Weather conditions complicated many of the assessments. Strong winds in the late afternoon dispersed dust across open surfaces, occasionally altering the appearance of areas that had already been examined. On some days, gusts reached speeds that made drone stability difficult, forcing operators to postpone flights. In other instances, shifting shadows created challenges for visual inspections, particularly near dusk, when the contours of the land could change dramatically in appearance. These environmental factors extended the time needed to verify each shaft. In the context of a missing child investigation, delays of even a few hours felt significant, yet safety protocols meant teams could not rush. The terrain also posed operational obstacles. Access routes to certain shafts were difficult to navigate due to erosion, uneven ground, or dense patches of low vegetation. In places, vehicles could not be used, and searchers had to carry equipment by foot. This limited the number of shafts that could be reached in a single day. The weight of robotics gear, atmospheric monitors, and safety rigging added to the strain. Each site required setting up, assessing, recording, and packing down before teams could move on. Investigators were aware that these delays contributed to public frustration, but conditions dictated the pace. A pattern soon emerged. Shaft after shaft returned no evidence of Gus Lamont. Each negative result brought relief in the sense that no hazardous discovery had been made. Yet disappointment lingered because the absence of findings prolonged uncertainty. Search leaders communicated regularly with the public, emphasizing that the lack of evidence did not rule out the possibility of a shaft being involved. Many shafts remained concealed, partially collapsed, or inaccessible. Others lay beyond immediate operational reach and required additional equipment or favorable conditions. Several locations were placed on a list of sites requiring delayed assessment. These included deeper shafts with unstable edges, depressions partially obstructed by fallen debris, and areas where wind had caused repeated dust layering that needed to be cleared before meaningful inspection could occur. In some cases, the risk to search personnel outweighed the immediate value of entering the site. Specialist mine rescue operators were scheduled to return once additional structural supports could be transported and installed. Until then, those shafts remained open lines of inquiry. Throughout this stage of the investigation, investigators documented every site meticulously. Reports included depth measurements, environmental readings, drone imagery, and ground-level observations. These records ensured that no area would need to be re-examined unless conditions changed or new information emerged. They also allowed teams to track progress across a large and varied landscape. As weeks passed, pressure from the public and media increased. Each update that resulted in no definitive findings added to the sense of urgency surrounding the disappearance of Gus Lamont. While investigators remained focused on methodical assessment, the expectation for new information heightened. Families across the state followed developments closely, aware of how challenging outback terrain can be, and yet hopeful that progress would be made. The emotional weight of repeated negative results was felt by search teams as well, though they continued to emphasize that thoroughness was essential. The methodical inspection of shafts laid the groundwork for the next phase of analysis. Understanding which sites had been cleared allowed investigators to refine their theories and consider alternative explanations while maintaining focus on environmental hazards.
The subsequent part of this narrative examines how public perception evolved during this time and why the absence of concrete evidence influenced both community reaction and investigative direction. As the search for Gus Lamont progressed through multiple phases, public attention intensified in ways that reflected both the uncertainty of the case and the deep emotional impact of a child going missing in a remote Australian environment. Community response is an important part of any major disappearance, not only because of the scale of public involvement, but because the expectations placed on investigators often influence how the narrative unfolds. Understanding these psychological dynamics helps explain why the disappearance of Gus captured national concern and why every update, particularly those yielding no results, contributed to a heightened sense of unease. One of the primary reasons the public became particularly absorbed in this case was the combination of location and circumstances. Australians have long held a complex relationship with the Outback. It is viewed as both iconic and unforgiving. When a young child disappears in such an environment, the sense of vulnerability is magnified. People recognize that the remote landscape provides fewer safety nets than urban or suburban settings. At the same time, they expect that its openness should offer clues. When those clues fail to appear, confusion and concern escalate. This tension between expectation and reality shaped much of the public reaction as the search for Gus continued. A common theme in community discussion was the urgent desire for a first piece of physical evidence. In cases involving unknown circumstances, the absence of any confirmed item or trace creates a psychological vacuum. People look for something tangible to anchor their understanding of events. Without such an anchor, theories grow more diverse and complex. This case presented exactly that challenge. Despite extensive searching, no object belonging to Gus Lamont, no footprint, and no disturbed vegetation were found near the homestead. This absence led many members of the public to feel that the situation remained suspended in uncertainty. They hoped that search teams would eventually uncover something, even if it did not provide full answers, because any piece of information would break the stalemate of not knowing. The emotional response from parents was particularly strong. For many, the idea of a child disappearing without a trace evokes a deep, instinctive fear. Parents consider their own children and imagine how quickly a moment of routine can become critical. The fact that Gus disappeared within a familiar area contributed to the widespread anxiety. Families across Australia related to the scenario of a child playing outside and being called inside minutes later. The contrast between the familiarity of the activity and the severity of the outcome intensified the sense of unease. This fear is not rooted in specific evidence, but in the psychological discomfort of recognizing that routine situations can shift unexpectedly. Comparisons with other missing child cases in Australian history also shaped public perception. Several high-profile disappearances have remained unresolved despite extensive investigation. These cases have created long-lasting scars on the national consciousness and heightened sensitivity to incidents involving young children. Although each case differs in detail, the collective memory influences how new cases are interpreted. When the search for Gus Lamont produced no immediate results, some individuals began drawing parallels, expressing concern that this case might follow a similar unresolved path. Investigators were aware of these concerns, but emphasized that each case requires independent analysis and cannot be equated simply because of shared elements of uncertainty. Another factor shaping public expectation was the belief held by some that a third party might have been involved. This possibility emerged in community discussion early on, not because of confirmed evidence, but because the absence of physical signs challenged assumptions about a child wandering off. When people cannot reconcile available facts with common explanations, alternative possibilities gain attention. The belief in third-party involvement does not necessarily reflect suspicion, but rather an attempt to make sense of circumstances that appear inconsistent with typical patterns of childhood behavior or environmental hazards. Authorities addressed these discussions carefully, reiterating that all scenarios were considered,
but must be grounded in tangible evidence before being adopted as primary lines of inquiry. An additional challenge during this phase was the spread of misinformation and digitally manipulated images on social media platforms. Advances in artificial intelligence have made it easier for false content to circulate rapidly, often appearing convincing to untrained viewers. Some of the images claimed to show evidence connected to the search, while others presented speculative scenarios. These materials added confusion and heightened emotional response within the community. Search teams and police were required to issue clarifications, emphasizing which information was credible and which originated from unreliable sources. This process placed added pressure on investigators, who had to manage not only the physical search but also the digital environment surrounding it. The role of the media contributed another layer to public expectation. News outlets reported updates regularly, reflecting the national attention the case had generated. While media coverage is essential for community awareness and potential information gathering, it also creates a cycle in which the public anticipates developments at a pace faster than the investigation can realistically deliver. Underground searches, especially those involving old mine shafts, take considerable time. Each site must be approached with caution, documented thoroughly, and assessed according to safety protocols. Because of this, days could pass without new information, leading some individuals to express frustration or fear that progress had stalled. SAPOL and the search teams experienced increasing pressure as a result. Their responsibility extended beyond operational duties. They were expected to maintain transparency, provide reassurance, and communicate clearly about obstacles and limitations. Each statement required careful wording to balance factual accuracy with sensitivity to the emotional impact the case had on the community. The timing of updates had to be considered, as releasing incomplete information risked fueling speculation, while withholding it risked undermining public trust. Navigating these challenges demanded a disciplined communication strategy. Despite the pressure, there was also a consistent flow of community support. People from surrounding towns offered assistance, resources, and local knowledge. Others from across the state expressed solidarity with the Lamont family. This support reflected a broader Australian cultural value. When someone faces hardship, especially in remote areas, communities often respond collectively. Still, the emotional weight of watching the search unfold without clear outcomes contributed to a sustained sense of collective tension. Many felt that the landscape itself was withholding answers, and this perception deepened the psychological impact of the disappearance. Another psychological factor was the desire for closure. Even though the community understood that complex investigations take time, uncertainty is difficult to endure. People hoped that the search would yield information that allowed them to understand what had happened to Gus Lamont, even if the news was difficult. The absence of such information meant the case remained open-ended, and with each passing day, the weight of uncertainty grew. This sentiment was amplified by the knowledge that the Outback is capable of concealing events in ways that defy expectation. As the investigation moved forward, these collective emotions and expectations influenced how updates were received. A negative result did not offer relief, but instead reinforced the perception that the situation remained unresolved. A positive development, even if minor, had the potential to shift public mood significantly. Authorities recognized this dynamic and continued to emphasize the importance of patience and methodical work. The community's emotional state during this phase provided context for the next stage of investigation, in which various potential scenarios were examined in greater detail. With many shafts already assessed and ruled out, attention turned towards evaluating alternative explanations, while still acknowledging that environmental hazards remained a plausible factor. When a disappearance presents no clear physical trace, investigators must examine multiple scenarios concurrently, treating each as a working hypothesis until evidence allows it to be strengthened or discounted. In the case of Gus Lamont, the outback environment, the lack of surface indicators, and the complexity of the terrain required a broad and balanced analytical approach.
None of the potential explanations stood out as definitive. Each carried its own degree of plausibility, shaped by environmental factors and the limitations of what had been discovered during the search. This phase of the investigation focused on assessing 4 main scenarios while maintaining a neutral stance, recognizing that definitive conclusions could not be drawn without further evidence. The first scenario remained the most operationally prioritized, the possibility that Gus fell into an abandoned mine shaft. As documented earlier, the region surrounding Oak Park Station contains a long history of mining activity, leaving behind numerous shafts of varying sizes and depths. Some are well documented, others are not. Even with systematic assessment already undertaken, many shafts remained difficult to access, partially concealed, or structurally unstable. The absence of footprints or ground disturbance near the homestead did not diminish the relevance of this scenario. A fall into a concealed shaft could occur silently and may leave little surface evidence. The outback landscape's tendency to shift, combined with wind and dust movement, further complicates surface detection. For these reasons, investigators kept this scenario at the forefront of the operational plan. It aligned with the physical characteristics of the environment and with documented incidents in similar locations across Australia. The second scenario involved the possibility that Gus wandered away from the homestead and that any tracks he may have left were erased by environmental conditions. Wind plays a significant role in shaping the terrain around Oak Park Station. During certain periods of the day, especially late afternoon, gusts can move loose dust rapidly across the ground. Footprints in finer soil can fade quickly, sometimes within minutes. This scenario required careful examination of weather records and local reports from the day of the disappearance. While some wind activity was noted, investigators had to consider whether it was strong enough to obscure all traces of movement. Additionally, the terrain immediately around the homestead includes areas of more compacted soil, where footprints tend to be retained for longer. The absence of tracks in these sections reduced the plausibility of this scenario, though did not eliminate it. A child moving in a slightly different direction or stepping in areas where soil compaction varied could still potentially leave minimal surface evidence. A third scenario examined the possibility of an accident unrelated to a mine shaft, such as a fall into an erosion channel, a concealed depression, or a rock formation. The outback contains natural hazards that can pose risks even to adults. Erosion over time creates channels that are sometimes obscured by vegetation or dust layering. These can vary in depth and may not be visible until approached closely. A small child could misjudge the stability of the ground or step onto loose soil near the edge of such a feature. Unlike mine shafts, these natural formations tend to be shallow, though some can reach significant depths depending on historical weather patterns. Investigators considered whether such an accident could occur without generating audible noise or visible disturbance. While possible, most natural depressions in the immediate area had either been examined or were unlikely to obscure a child completely without leaving clues. Still, this scenario remained under review because natural hazards are often underestimated in remote environments. The fourth scenario involved the possibility of third-party involvement. This scenario received considerable attention from some members of the public, in part due to the psychological discomfort associated with unexplained disappearances. However, investigators were cautious in addressing it. There was no evidence indicating that another person had been present during the relevant time period. No unusual vehicles were reported, no signs of forced entry, and no disturbances suggesting a confrontation. The remoteness of the property further reduced the likelihood of an unobserved visitor. Nonetheless, investigators could not dismiss the scenario outright. In any disappearance, it is standard practice to consider whether another person may have been involved, intentionally or unintentionally. This scenario remained in the investigative framework, but its plausibility depended entirely on evidence that had not yet emerged. Each of these scenarios held a specific place within the investigative analysis. The mineshaft scenario was operationally prioritized because it aligned most closely with environmental hazards known to exist in the area. The wandering scenario required weather-related analysis and offered a possible explanation for the lack of tracks, though surface conditions near the house made it less likely. Natural terrain accidents remained possible, but had limitations based on site inspections already conducted. Third-party involvement was considered a theoretical possibility, but lacked physical indicators to support it. Investigators maintained a careful balance when communicating about these scenarios. Public expectations, shaped by the emotional weight of the disappearance, often sought definitive answers. However, providing certainty without evidence risks misleading the community or narrowing the investigative scope prematurely. Sapol's approach reflected standard investigative practice. Avoid exclusion of any scenario until the evidence permits it. In a remote environment with known hazards and incomplete terrain documentation, ruling out possibilities early could compromise the search. Another factor supporting the continued inclusion of all scenarios was the absence of any item belonging to Gus Lamont. Investigators found no clothing, no toy, and no object that could indicate direction of movement. In many missing child cases, even small items serve as markers that allow reconstruction of the route taken. Here, the lack of such items prevented investigators from narrowing the possibilities. Each scenario remained open because none had been positively linked to available evidence. The timeline also influenced the assessment. The 30-minute window between 5 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. was short, yet long enough for several different outcomes to occur. A fall into a shaft requires only seconds. A child wandering a short distance into challenging terrain is plausible. A misstep near an erosion channel could occur without witnesses. Even scenarios involving another person, while unlikely, cannot be ruled out without corroborating information. Investigators had to respect the complexity of that time frame. The investigative team's neutrality extended to internal decision-making. Participants from different fields, geologists, tracking experts, mine rescue personnel, and child safety investigators, provided input. Each scenario was evaluated not based on speculation, but on measurable factors: terrain structure, environmental conditions, documented hazards, and search results. This collaborative approach ensured that no scenario received undue emphasis simply because it was more familiar or more publicly discussed. As search efforts continued and additional shafts were assessed, the scenario analysis evolved. Scenarios were not abandoned. Instead, they were reweighted based on emerging information. The mine shaft scenario remained prominent because many sites had not yet been fully inspected. The wandering scenario required further cross-checking against weather records. Natural hazards needed continued mapping. Third-party involvement required ongoing exclusion through verification of property access, regional activity, and any potential witness statements. By the end of this phase, investigators reiterated that the absence of evidence did not serve as evidence of absence. This principle applied to all scenarios. The Outback environment is capable of concealing small clues, shifting dust rapidly, and complicating acoustic detection. It is also a landscape where human activity can be sparse and where natural hazards may mimic or obscure signs of movement. These factors collectively justified the continued examination of multiple possibilities. As the investigation progressed into its next stage, attention turned towards the impact on the Lamont family and the broader community. The psychological strain of extended uncertainty, combined with sustained public interest, shaped the context in which investigators communicated their findings. The following part of the narrative explores how the family navigated this prolonged period, and how their experience intersected with the ongoing search for answers regarding the disappearance of Gus Lamont. For the Lamont family at Oak Park Station, the disappearance of Gus unfolded not only as an investigative challenge, but as an extended emotional ordeal shaped by the remoteness of their home, the pace of the search, and the uncertainty that grew with each passing day. While investigators focused on methodical assessment and parallel scenarios, the family faced the relentless psychological strain of waiting for information that could shift from hopeful to distressing within moments.
Understanding their experience is essential to describing the context in which the search continued and how the human dimension shaped the broader narrative. Life on a remote station is often characterized by resilience and independence, but those qualities do not shield families from the impact of crisis. In the early hours of the disappearance, the environment that had once felt familiar and manageable began to take on a different meaning for the Lamonts. The vast stretches of land that normally represented livelihood and routine suddenly became overwhelming. Every paddock, ridge, and depression seemed to carry potential significance. The family had to reconcile their knowledge of the land with the unsettling idea that it might conceal something beyond their sight. Watching the search unfold around them became part of their daily reality. As specialist teams arrived, each bringing different equipment and expertise, the family observed procedures that were necessary but confronting. The inspection of mine shafts was particularly difficult to witness. These were areas they had lived near for years, often without giving them more than practical attention. Seeing drone operators scan the landscape, watching robots being lowered into deep, unstable shafts, and observing rescue personnel prepare for hazardous descent meant confronting the possibility that these features could be linked to what had happened to Gus Lamont. The technical precision of the work was reassuring in one sense, yet each new shaft inspected brought the same cycle of anticipation and uncertainty. Hope, during this period, was not a fixed state. It moved in response to updates, pauses, and the shifting focus of the search. When teams identified a new shaft requiring careful examination, the family braced themselves. The potential for answers created a momentary lift in expectation. When those shafts produced no findings, the emotional decline was immediate. This fluctuation between hope and disappointment repeated many times, forming a rhythm that was difficult to endure. Families facing long-term uncertainty often describe this pattern as one of the most draining aspects of prolonged searches, and the Lamont family experienced that cycle repeatedly as results came in. Despite the emotional toll, the family maintained an outward presence during the operation. They communicated with search coordinators, remained accessible to police, and participated in public appeals. Their statements were measured and respectful, reflecting both their concern for Gus and their trust in the people assisting with the search. These appeals were directed not only toward potential witnesses, but also toward the broader community, reinforcing the importance of continued attention on the case. The family understood that public visibility can be a critical factor in long-running investigations, even when answers do not appear immediately. Community support played a significant role in sustaining the family during this period. People from nearby towns, as well as from more distant parts of the state, offered assistance ranging from meals and supplies to help with station duties. In remote areas, where neighbors may live many kilometers apart, such support carries particular weight. The Outback community is accustomed to challenges, and when one family faces hardship, others often step in without hesitation. This support did not resolve the uncertainty, but it provided the Lamont family with resources and reassurance at a time when both were needed. The increasing presence of media added another layer to the family's experience. While media coverage helped maintain public focus on the search for Gus Lamont, it also brought scrutiny. Reporters visiting the property or nearby towns required careful communication, and the family had to balance their desire for privacy with the need to keep the investigation in public view. They provided statements, avoided speculation, and focused on conveying their hope that continued efforts would lead to answers. At the same time, they were aware that each interview or public comment might reach a national audience, adding pressure to articulate their emotions in a composed manner. As days turned into weeks, the emotional fatigue deepened. Prolonged missing person cases are known to affect families in specific psychological ways. The absence of closure prevents the natural progression of coping. Instead of moving through stages of grief or acceptance, families remain in a suspended state. Every possible scenario remains both feared and hoped against. For the Lamont family, the ongoing evaluation of mine shafts, erosion channels, and alternative explanations meant that many different outcomes remained plausible.
This uncertainty intensified the emotional strain and made it difficult to establish routines that might otherwise provide comfort. The family also faced the challenge of maintaining perspective in an environment filled with speculation. Public discussion, particularly online, often introduced theories or opinions that were not grounded in evidence. The rise of artificial imagery and misinformation added complexity. While investigators worked to clarify inaccuracies, the family had to navigate these narratives without allowing them to influence their understanding of the investigation. This required a disciplined focus on official updates and direct communication with SAPOL, reinforcing the importance of trust between families and investigators.
Another emotional factor came from observing the physical effort undertaken by search teams. Seeing personnel examine hazardous shafts, navigate uneven terrain, and work through heat, wind, and dust reminded the family that the search for Gus Lamont was being conducted with diligence and care. This awareness brought both comfort and distress. It was comforting to know that specialists were committed to the search, yet distressing to realize that such extensive efforts still yielded no definitive findings. The combination of gratitude and frustration is a common emotional outcome for families in extended searches, and the Lamonts experienced this duality throughout the process. In moments where hope re-emerged, it was often linked to procedural developments, the arrival of new equipment, the identification of a new shaft requiring assessment, or the decision to expand a particular search zone. These details, while operational in nature, carried emotional significance.
They represented the possibility that the next phase might bring clarity. At the same time, the family had to temper hope with caution, understanding that investigations of this kind rarely move in straight lines. The psychological impact of a prolonged disappearance does not accumulate evenly. It shifts depending on time of day, the pace of updates, and the nature of information received. For the Lamont family, evenings were often more challenging. As search teams concluded daily operations and prepared for the next morning, the quietness of the property could heighten anxiety. Days with new developments felt different from days with little change. The emotional landscape was shaped not only by what was known, but also by what remained unknown. As the investigation continued, the family maintained their presence as the central human element of the case. Their resilience, shaped by both personal strength and community support, remained evident.
Yet beneath that surface lay the profound difficulty of navigating uncertainty. Their experience reflected the broader emotional weight carried by many families involved in long-term searches in remote environments. This phase of the narrative leads naturally to the next stage of the investigation, which focuses on how authorities evaluated remaining search zones and planned subsequent operations in the absence of definitive evidence. The following part examines the search strategy moving forward and how investigators balanced persistence with the need for methodical progress in efforts to determine what happened to Gus Lamont. At the current stage of the investigation, several areas around Oak Park Station remain either partially examined or completely inaccessible due to safety concerns. Some shafts are too unstable for entry, with loose edges and internal collapses that pose an unacceptable risk to personnel. Others sit in terrain that requires additional engineering work before heavy equipment or rescue gear can be brought in. These locations form the basis of planning for any renewed phase of the search for Gus Lamont. A potential new operation would focus on making those high-risk sites safer to assess. This may involve installing temporary supports, clearing access tracks, and revisiting earlier mapping with more advanced tools. Ground-penetrating radar and higher-resolution LiDAR are among the technologies being considered to build a clearer picture of what lies beneath the surface, particularly in areas where historic records of mining are incomplete or unreliable. Despite the time that has passed, disused mine workings remain central to operational thinking. The combination of regional mining history, the absence of surface evidence, and the nature of the terrain means that underground hazards cannot yet be ruled out. At the same time, investigators remain open to other explanations, maintaining the broader framework of scenarios developed earlier in the case.
members of the public continue to wait for three key developments. They hope for a first confirmed clue, however small, an update from SAPOL that narrows the field of possibilities, and a clear indication of progress from mine specialists working in the region. For now, all discussion remains in the realm of hypothesis and investigative analysis. No single theory has been confirmed, and no conclusion has been reached about what happened to Gus Lamont. The case remains formally unresolved.